Well, hello everyone. It's so great to be with you. Can you all hear me? Okay, it's hard to tell sometimes because you can't hear your own voice. It's so nice to be here with all of you in Miami, actually live and in person. This is one of my favorite things that I do, which is get to talk to audiences like you. And let me just start by saying I am a professional storyteller. So this is what I like to do more than just about anything. I guess as a day job, I moonlight as the managing director of research at Longfellow Real Estate Partners. Longfellow is the largest privately held life sciences developer in the United States. We currently have about a 10 million square foot portfolio with about another 7 million square foot pipeline. And all we do is lab development. Prior to Longfellow, I came from Jones Lang LaSalle, where I was the research director for the Philadelphia region for about 7 years. So I live and breathe data. Prior to all of that, I used to do economic development research, and I never really thought I would stay in a research role this long. I really thought at this point in my life I would be doing something else in real estate, hopefully. But here we are. And in a lot of ways, I would say my role at Longfellow is to be the chief data ninja. So I'll talk a little bit more about what I feel that means. But I wanted today to talk to you a little bit about how we got to the place where data has become so critical in commercial real estate, how we analyze data to tell a story, and then I was also hoping to tell you a story. So I have some information about the life sciences market, but also, as I said, I get to do this frequently because I'm so lucky, and I want to invite you to ask questions as well. I love when people just raise their hand, or you can save them to the end, but interruptions are welcome. We're in a fairly small room, so it's no problem however you'd like to approach this. So I'll dive in with some slides, but if I see hands go up, or if you're submitting questions on the app, I'd be glad to take them at any point in time. There's no need to be shy. Whoop. So how did we get here? What is data-driven storytelling, and why is it important in terms of what we do in the commercial sector? So I feel like this really got started in 2005 with a television show that some people in this room might remember called Flip This House. So back in the day, some folks got the notion that really what individuals would love to see is people flipping properties, making money. Real estate's kind of the great equalizer on the residential side, and really, how could you get in the game as an individual? So we know this show started in 2005, and there's been various successive add-on shows to what I would call is the real estate voyeurism phenomenon, which is essentially people just love to look at other people's real estate. They love to see what fixtures they have in the bathroom. They love to see what paint color they chose. And then they started to want to see how people were buying real estate. So I got really hooked on this show in my young years because I was like, oh my God, international real estate, how do people buy it? Where do they buy it? How do you find an apartment in Prague? And I felt like this was an amazing education for what I found to be a fascinating phenomenon. It's probably the show that started my real estate career, if we're going to be completely honest about it. So as we got more into each other's houses, in many ways I feel this show began to spur, which was the last economic recession, in which everybody sort of thought, I can be a property owner and have multiple commercial properties. I can fix up my own house. And banks started lending and people started spending, and the next thing you know, we have the collapse in 08 and 09. So maybe it's not always been a great thing, but it's definitely spawned an entire network of television, an entire series devoted to, I'll just call them hot men doing construction. I don't know what else to call the Property Brothers, but I have watched many hours of this show myself. And really this is fueled by the fact that we all live in, consume, and operate in real estate, not just as a profession, but as individuals. So really, they've basically educated all of America on how to be a real estate professional through the content that has been developed and pushed out to us through HGTV. And then the last thing I'll say that I think is an interesting evolution of this phenomenon is really what we started to see on social media. So, for example, Houzz is a platform where you can go and you can look at essentially what types of furniture you would fit into a space. You can look at what other people have purchased. You can begin to shop and style your room. I've actually used design services from online platforms myself. Modsy is one that I love. And then also Instagram is really a place where people go to kind of look and see how other people live. So all of these platforms, all of this information, all of this socialization has produced an entire generation, maybe even two at this point, of people who believe that they're real estate experts. And then it led us to residential companies that were essentially convincing us that we could invest effectively on an individual basis, on our rental basis. We heard about Zillow apartment rental earlier today. And then also kind of getting, tours without having to engage with people, essentially like looking at your estimates for the value of your home. How many people here get their either Zillow estimate or Redfin estimate on a regular basis and actually like open that email? Yeah, I'm seeing like hands go up, right? You want to understand what the value of your home is, but you don't want to go to a professional. You don't want to have to engage with a broker. You don't want to have to go and get an appraisal, but you really want to know, like, how are you doing with relationship to your peers? How are you doing with relationship to your comp set, right? And this has driven, I think, massive innovation on the residential side around pricing modeling, as well as giving consumers tools to understand where they sit in the competitive set of their own home, their own rental property, or maybe their own small portfolio. So this has really changed, I think, the consumer expectations and has had some implications for how we interact on the commercial side with our data, how our tenants interact on the commercial side with our data, and what the experience of buying, renting property, even on the commercial side, what that's become. So nobody laughed at this, but this is one of my favorite slides, and I think it wildly illustrates the challenges that we face in the commercial real estate world around data and data storytelling. So when I first started my career at JLL, I was working with a bunch of brokers, and in about 6 months' time, I realized that there were essentially 2 types of people in commercial real estate. Only 2. I will be challenged by anybody who wants to talk to me about this, but I will say that there are only 2, and they are chaos Muppets and order Muppets. So there's a great piece in Slate a number of years ago that's essentially become my unifying theory for how research works in real estate. And that's to say, in this piece, the author talks about how every Muppet that you encounter is either of the chaos variety or the order variety. So the chaos Muppets, I have animal up here, but think like Cookie Monster, or think about like Bunsen and Beaker, right? Like total chaos, like explosions going off in the kitchen, like drum sets blaring and cookie crumbs flying everywhere. These people are very much akin to brokers. Without brokers, we don't have cookies, but they do create a lot of chaos, but they do give us a lot of transactional data. So in the Muppet order system, they are very valuable. However, to be able to make sense of the information that the chaos Muppets bring to the table, you need order Muppets. So researchers are very much order Muppets. We're the Kermit the Frogs of the world. We're the reason that we can have nice things, and they're the way that we make sense of the universe, because we take all of the cookie crumbs and we take all of the drumsticks and we put them together and we say, what kind of information, analysis, and insight can we generate from all of this chaos that we experience in the real estate system? So we need the Kermits of the world, the researchers of the world, the technicians of the world to begin to bring those disparate pieces together to actually tell a coherent story about the market and what we think the outlook in the market's going to be. So I'm sure there's a number of people in this room that are like, wow, that's kind of cool. Like, how do we get started? Like, what are some of the key elements of this process? And I wanted to share with you just a couple of thoughts about the ways in which you or your team can begin to create even just a small insights platform. So when I do my work, I like to think of there being essentially 3 components to real estate analytics. And they are essentially the demand drivers. So what do we know about what the people or the companies are going to want out of their real estate? Or what do we know about the changing trends in real estate that would be indicative of future demand for space or for new geographic areas that space might be needed? So that's the demand side. Then we have the supply side. So what is the existing condition of the real estate? How much is there? You would be surprised how difficult it is to measure how much real estate actually exists. And that's because the data are really bad, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But not to mention that just even like the market dynamics of it, right? So supply side would obviously include what the real estate is, where the real estate is, and what new real estate might be developed. And then finally, on the what I'd call the market side of things, like the supply-demand interaction, where does that occur and what does that look like? That's where we get pricing. That's where we get pricing models from. So when you smash all of that together, you begin to create a very deep well of information that will enable you to look at the market critically and then hopefully to tell a story based on that market, which for those of you who work with investors or maybe are investors yourselves, you know that the story around the real estate is the most critical part of getting people to make commitments to invest or lease space. So I put this slide up here, so if you're like, hey, how do I get started? What might I like to do? This is by no means an exhaustive list, but like if I was starting a platform from scratch and didn't have, professional staff or didn't have expertise, I would start with a couple of these sources. So the first and on the left-hand side are publicly available sources. You would be blown away if you started really digging in on the census data to find just how much detailed information you can have to create the demand side of this story. It's wrapped up, but it's also really, really micro as well if you want to get into that level of detail. Bureau of Labor Statistics is great for telling the labor story. So where are my jobs? What kind of skills? What kind of degrees? Really good information there. Bureau of Economic Analysis is really where we would get our inflation measures from. We would also get a lot of high-level industry data for a very, very long, backward-looking time horizon. And then in everybody's state, there's also a labor market information agency that provides detailed analysis at the state level, at the county level. And sometimes if you're lucky and you live in a state with a good one, you'll find ones with zip code level data. If you have a little bit of money to spend. The private side of this makes using all of these data sources very easy, and it's worth spending some money on. So just 3 quick sources that might be good to mention here for a moment. The first being MZ. This is a tool that smashes all of this labor market data together, removes the confidentiality and suppression, gives you that zip code level information, and enables people who maybe don't want to mess around in pivot tables or maybe don't want to use stats packages, access to information that gives them really, really granular senses for what's going to happen, especially on the labor side of the equation. This logo down here is for Esri. Those of you who have any kind of mapping experience would know Esri. Esri essentially is the proprietary mapping platform that exists in which you can use any type of geospatial data to upload into it to create maps. You tend to need a professional for it unless you're using a product called Business Analyst. Business Analyst would then enable you to kind of interact with a map more in a Google type interface. And then lastly, I've heard CoStar mentioned a couple times today. For whatever challenges or positive aspects of it, it is a huge data warehouse. And if you have the inclination or the need to get to some good basic property data, it's definitely one of the go-tos. I am not giving endorsements for any of these platforms, but if you needed a place to get started, these are some good places to go. And then the last thing I wanted to say about data is you can also make it yourself. I think that people often think like, God, there's no data available, but I spent very early parts of my career creating my own data because there was none, essentially. So when I was working for a business improvement district in Philadelphia and we wanted to understand how many people walked down a shopping district corridor, I would stand there with a little clicker and count the people walking down the shopping district corridor. And I do it at 7:30 in the morning for an hour, and maybe at lunchtime for an hour, and maybe at 5 o'clock for an hour, and then said, okay, we think reasonably we can extrapolate that out to say X number of people walk past these retail corridors, and we believe the potential demand capture is Y because of the people that are just experiencing this corridor. Transaction data. I mean, if people buy and sell their own homes, you could start creating your own transaction data. You could probably aggregate Zillow data, frankly, or Redfin data. If you're in the leasing business, aggregating your own comps. If you've got enough scale, you probably have a pretty indicative look at the market overall for a certain geography that you could begin to generate some analysis and insight around. So this is all to simply say, quantify it. Do it yourself. Maybe it's not perfect, but some data can be translated into insight, even if you don't have full sufficiency. And then one other thing I want to talk about before I tell a little story here is, folks are like, okay, so I have all this data, these data. What do I do with it to make it sing? How do I tell a story with it? It's numbers on a page, it's over time, it has all of these unique characteristics to it if we're going back to the storefront example, whether it's on a corner or whether it's mid-block or, whether there was snow happening the day that you were counting the pedestrians or whether it was a hot day. How does that influence it, right? And there's a number of basic data transformations that really anybody can do to begin to mine their data to understand what the story might be. So I've listed a couple of approaches that I take here. I'm happy to talk more about these, though I see I've got 9 minutes left, so I want to stay on time. But basic ways of really understanding your own data. Basic transformations, so year-over-year calculations. You can start to draw graphs and create lines and understand trends just by doing that. You can index your data, so if you've got 10 years worth of data and you see in year 1 it started at 100 and you see in year 10 it started at 120, you can chart the path from 100 to 120 by using that baseline and basically determining that you've seen a 20% increase in that variable over that time horizon and drawing that picture in a graph. I love graphs. You'll see a couple of my graphs. I think it's really the best way to tell stories because it immediately generates credibility that you've done the deep work behind the information that you're sharing. And then also, I fundamentally believe that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So if you can show somebody data in a graph and you can tell a story with a graph, you automatically can communicate a lot more information. Mapping is another picture aspect that I would use whenever I could. Heat maps are a great way to demonstrate trends and information, as well as even just like dot maps, like graded dot maps can be really useful depending upon the data that you're looking at. And then essentially what you do once you get your data together is you're looking for patterns, you're looking for changes. You often need something to compare your data to. So if I'm looking at a lab market in Philadelphia, what other markets look like Philadelphia? What other market's seen a similar employment level? What other market has seen a similar increase in degree completers? Does that have implications for what the future of the lab market in Philadelphia might look like? Yes, choosing those is an art as much as it is a science, but it can be very valuable. Pie charts are appropriate if you want to demonstrate parts of a whole. Stack charts can be helpful if you want to look at multiple variables over time and compare them to one another. A basic time series or even callouts in the charts, which you'll see some of in the next section here, can really illuminate what the point is of the data. So this would be a great time to start thinking of questions. I'm going to go through the next couple of slides relatively quickly, but if you've got hands, anytime you want or anytime on the app. But I thought maybe we'd have a little bit of a story about lab in the United States. So this is the asset class that I spend most of my time on right now, and I'm going to break it down into those couple of buckets for you just here at a very high level. So when we think about the future of lab in the United States, it's a very niche asset class. It's about 150 million square feet of total space in the United States. This is in comparison to the 14 billion square feet of industrial that exist. So 150 million square feet is about the size of the Philadelphia office market overall. It's predominantly influenced by the influx of funding that comes from a few key sources. The first is NIH funding, or National Institutes of Health funding. This funding goes towards basic scientific research. And when we look at core lab markets across the country, core being Boston, San Francisco, San Diego, and North Carolina, you see that about 25% of all of that basic scientific research goes into those four markets overall. The rest goes to other parts of the country overall. But we'll get a little meta here. This is obviously a pie chart, right? So what we're trying to say is, all right, we see a very dense clustering of funding going to 4 places that has high dispersion around the rest of the country. So life sciences companies in primary markets accounted for 23% of that funding, that pie chart that I previously showed, and it's been accelerating significantly over the past 5 years, as you can see in the uprun in this chart. Raleigh-Durham has grown the most in this past decade. It's seen about 110% increase over that period of time. So when we look at the chart, what we're doing is we're taking those 4 core markets and we're showing how they've expanded and how they've expanded proportionally or disproportionately to the rest of the funding environment for basic scientific research. So another important driver is also venture capital funding. So this goes towards those companies that are accelerating in their growth phase. And where we saw 23% of all funding for NIH being concentrated in 4 markets, we see almost 60% being concentrated in those 4 core markets when it comes to venture capital funding, with Boston taking up about 1/3 of the entire pie here. So now we've got even more funding concentrating in these markets. So if I'm an investor, I'm going, like, where do I want to be? Do I want to be chasing product in a very hot market like Boston, where the prices are rising rapidly and cap rates are decreasing? Or do I want to be in a different market that's maybe not seen the peak yet? And is that market Raleigh-Durham, or is that market somewhere outside of these 4 key markets? So these are some questions that you begin to ask based on the data once you sort of understand that venture is very predictive of the expansion of space. So we know that the relationship between venture capital, based on research, is $1 million of funding equals about 400 square feet of net new space to the market. So I'm getting the high sign. I'm going to fly through just a couple more things. This is a way to texturize your data and your story. So we've looked at pie charts, and we've looked at stacked bars, and we've looked at all kinds of different things. But this is looking at specifically the biggest fundraisers by market for venture capital over a 3-year time horizon. So now we've taken all that information. We've said, okay, so if we want to understand these companies, who are they? What kinds of series are they raising? What kind of science do they do? And how mature are they? So this is something that I like to do just to give that extra bit of color. And then if we want to look at deal size, for example, this can also be interesting and predictive in terms of that total amount of space. And this chart illuminates some of those changes over time that I think are really interesting. So whereas we have seen Raleigh-Durham kind of stay at that 13 to 17 deal count, average deal size, call it between 18 and 39 million. We've seen a significantly higher volume in Boston and San Francisco, specifically at much larger average deal sizes. So what implications might that have? Then primary life sciences markets, they account for 10% of life sciences graduates. Well, what would happen if we were in a secondary market and built some product and created some companies where people could stay? Certain places have higher concentrations of life sciences graduates, which creates clusters, even if they don't have the largest volume of graduates. So for example, Los Angeles, not today like the life sciences hotbed of the world, but they do graduate over 17,000 people per year, and they do have a concentration of about 11%. Here's where we get into some of that mapping. So here are those markets. We're showing that total number of graduates and the total growth of those graduates over a 5-year horizon. So this, depending upon which comparators you choose, might have some implications for investment choices. Research and development jobs versus biomanufacturing jobs. How have they grown in primary life sciences markets, those 4 markets, versus other markets? So I hope that gave you a little bit of a sense for what, I would say would be a compelling investment case to make for either one of those existing markets or perhaps other markets, and maybe raises some questions for other places that you would consider investing. So I would be happy to take your questions. I would be happy to take your comments about either data storytelling, life sciences specifically, Philadelphia. We can talk about office, but whatever you might like to ask, I am here.
All right, we have one question through the app, which we'll do first. Other than Esri, what are impactful mapping softwares to help tell the story?
Does the AY team want to take this one? What do you guys use in your platform? I have great friends here from Avison and Young who do a lot of mapping work, so I'd love to know what you guys like to use, because I've always been an Esri consumer.
We've been building our own.
Yeah? If you weren't building your own, which one would you use? Nick?
Yeah, I was going to say the challenge with some of those kind of mapping platforms is they're so highly technical.
Yeah.
So you kind of end up having to be a technician to kind of not only find the data, but then utilize the data.
Mm-hmm.
So you want something as easy as kind of like you expect in a Google-based environment.
Mm-hmm.
There's not many of those solutions.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a big technical challenge with bringing all the data that you care is relevant, and as you mentioned, having that technical expertise. So we see a lot of it across the industry moving into services organizations, and it's hard to find products that really do the kind of
I mean, to their point, frankly, Esri creates certified analysts, and there's a whole industry of certification behind them just to be able to use their own software, which is really challenging to this whole point. We've moved more towards open mapping in certain cases, but it's not as robust, especially as you get into larger data sets as kind of the traditional product like Esri, which leads folks to build their own.
We have time for a few more if you want to raise your hand.
Yeah, please.
When will the latest census data begin to be baked into all that? What would you guess be on that?
So that's an interesting question. So the latest census was built in 2010. I believe that we have the summary file ones back. We might have some of the more detailed ones back yet, but as I mentioned, I like to use MZ as a platform kind of for analyzing labor trends and increasingly use BAO, business analyst, for analyzing those population trends. So the beauty of kind of tools like that have that interface as well as the data behind it is that they often model the data. So while we might not have all of the detail down to the census block level at this point in time, because it takes the Bureau years to process all of the records and make sure there's no confidentiality issues, these companies will go through and do their own processing of it. So you can get access to 2021 data in Business Analyst online through Esri today. I would say it's reliable enough for real estate. I don't know if I would do like a true scientific study based on those estimates, but nonetheless, I think for the type of work that we do, it's highly reliable. Same thing with MZ on the labor side.
We got time for one more.
Ask me anything. Yes?
Geno's or Pat's?
Oh, Tony Luke's. Tony Luke's, because I don't like cheesesteaks, so I'm going to go with the chicken cheesesteak at Tony Luke's. Just saying. You can hate on me if you want.
All right. Everyone, please give a warm round of
Thank you.
applause for Lauren.
Thank you. Okay.